Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Rust on Freedom 95, 950 AM and 95.9 FM on your radio dial. Folks, we have a lot of news this week to pack in. We're going to start out with the Iran war. We talked about that a lot last week. And if you all recall, and I put up billboards all across the state of Indiana for calling for this right now, we must axe the gas tax here in Indiana. You know, I am again calling for Governor Braun to immediately suspend the gasoline tax here in Indiana, which is one of the highest in the country. Actually, your gasoline tax, folks, just went up 2 cents a gallon just a few days ago. And folks, gasoline prices are high not just because of the gasoline tax, it's of course also because of the Iran war. In news this week on the Iran war, Jim Banks' favorite U.S. Senator, Lindsey Grahamnesty, was caught literally red-handed at Disney World holding a princess toy of some sort in his hand. I don't know what that was all about.
Sounds about right for Lindsey Grahamnesty.
For someone like him, it sounds pretty right. I'd love to ask him, Senator Banks, what was your friend doing at Disney World with that pink toy of his?
And why weren't you there with him also?
Well, he may have been. We don't know where he was.
Well, he probably hid from the camera.
You know, was Jim Banks with him? Did Jim Banks pick out the toy? You know, those are questions that we need answers to.
Exactly. It's hard to say what those two get up to in their free time.
So, folks, in all seriousness on this, Lindsey Grahamnesty, and I call him Lindsey Grahamnesty, that's Rush Limbaugh's nickname for Lindsey Graham, because Lindsey Grahamnesty pushed for broad amnesty for all illegal aliens not that long ago, just a few years ago.
I think it was during the Gang of Eight debacle.
Jim Banks called for an influx of immigration. Of course, he would pal around with someone who is calling for amnesty for all illegals and was working to do that through the Gang of Eight. But in news this week, and while we're talking about it this week, folks, he just went to Disney World while the Department of Homeland Security is not being funded. The U.S. Senate went on vacation, literally to Disney World, while our TSA agents are not being paid. You know, that's just a load of crap. I'm sorry. The Iran war is serious as a heart attack, and we talked about this on the show last week, where there are actually preparations in place for a possible ground invasion, and there's news on that. This is from Bricks News on Twitter. Just in, Israeli Channels 12 says Israeli soldiers will not take part in any potential U.S. ground operations in Iran.
Cowards.
Everyone is always very hip to go off to war when it is American blood that will be spilled. If Israel pushed us into this war, and it sounds like that's what happened now, why on earth will they not put up their troops as well?
Well, they have a history of doing this, and I would also point out that Bibi Netanyahu has a history of telling us, in 2002, he said if we took out Saddam, the Middle East would be far better. Well, it's not, Bibi.
Well, and what happened, folks, you know, again, Lindsey Graham told South Carolinians to send their sons and daughters to war while he goes to Disney World and buys toys.
He should be going overseas instead, since he's so enthusiastic about it.
And to add on what you said, he's an overgrown child. And by the way, he's up for re-election. If South Carolinians, if you can force him into a runoff, he will lose in third place and he won't advance.
Well, that would be the best thing on earth, would be to get him out of the U.S. Senate.
Amen.
Absolutely.
You know, obviously, he probably should have never even went in the first place.
That's right.
But he is using the advantages of incumbency, and that's what Jim Banks is doing right now, folks. That's why he's palling around with people like Lindsey Grahamnesty, because he wants their money and he wants their connections and close personal friendship. You remember, folks, he came around to Indiana with Lindsey Grahamnesty and talked about military operations, you know, together here in Indianapolis. So, folks, 52% of Trump voters say the military operation against Iran has been a costly mistake, which could cause Republicans serious issues in the midterm elections. And that's not even addressing a potential ground invasion. Again, folks, while I'm extremely upset about this, it is absolutely absurd that the United States Congress has left town on a 2-week recess, 2-week vacation, amidst the longest Department of Homeland Security shutdown in history, during peak travel season and during a war. In what other industry is that abandonment of a job duty acceptable? Only if you're a career politician.
Yeah, because you do that in the private sector, you get fired.
And make sure to vote against the incumbents, because the incumbents are the problem. They've been the ones who have been in there and have been just absolutely destroying the country. Unless the incumbents, I mean, if the incumbents are really good, then obviously I'm going to vote for them.
But vote him out.
Well, I'd say that at this point it's only Thomas Massey and Rand Paul. I can't think of anyone else at a
I would
national
100%
level.
agree with you.
Of course.
Yeah.
So Lindsey Graham went to Disney World. We don't know, did Jim Banks go with him? You know, folks, I'm a farmer, and when I see these people with no work ethic going on perpetual vacations, you know, literally when the ox is in the well, when we're at war, when the Department of Homeland Security is not being funded, you don't just drop whatever you're doing in D.C. and say, oh, I'm hitting the beach in Florida. I'm going to go to Disney World.
You're squandering this, and Justin, I would even ask you this: what is he? Why at Disney World? I thought Disney was one of the wokest companies of all time.
And folks, it is actions by people like Lindsey Grahamnesty and Jim Banks that is why the Democrats are now favored to win the U.S. Senate in poly-market future predictions. It has just went above 50% for the first time, folks, that the U.S. Senate is now likely to head into Democratic hands thanks to Lindsey Grahamnesty, Jim Banks, Todd Young, all these people who voted for trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of new debt, destroying the value of the American dollar. You know, when Jim Banks and Todd Young voted to add those trillions of dollars, and they additionally voted to fund government at Joe Biden levels of spending, of course conservatives will say, well, I'm just going to sit this one out. No one's going to go in and vote enthusiastically for someone like Jim Banks or Lindsey Grahamnesty. They just won't. They are sick of the lies. They are sick of the false pretenses where they thump their chest and say how conservative they are on TV or in their Twitter, but their votes and their actions in D.C. are the exact opposite. And I know this very well with Jim Banks, folks. You can just tell he absolutely wants the U.S. Senate to fall into Democratic hands because he would be much more comfortable being a fake conservative in a Democrat majority Congress. Then he can say, well, I'm opposed to that, even though he just voted for it himself when the Republicans were in control.
And not only that, he's familiar with that setting. When he was in the House of Representatives, he was there when Nancy Pelosi had the Speaker's gavel. He complained about her on TV, but his voting record didn't match his rhetoric even then.
You know, I think
Democratic hands, by the way.
I think it goes back to what John said about like work ethic and how they're always on vacation. It's like they have no work ethic. They don't want to do anything. That's why they want to be in the minority, so they can just sit there and moan and whine about everything and not actually do anything to try to solve the problem.
And it doesn't matter who's in the majority. To add on to your point, it doesn't matter who's in the majority because Jim Banks has proven, regardless of who's in whether it's him, his guys, or the Democrats in the majority, he'll still vote for big spending. He'll do it when he thinks you're not looking.
Well, listen to this, folks. Measured relative to the GDP, the gross domestic product, Jim Banks and Todd Young in 1 year have added 3 times as much debt to the federal debt as Joe Biden did in 4 years. I'm going to say that again, folks. Just in 1 year, measured relative to the gross domestic product, Jim Banks and Todd Young have added 3 times as much federal debt to our nation's debt as Joe Biden did in 4 years. Washington's spending is out of control. These spendaholics like Banks and Young are bankrupting our country.
Gives a new name to, Jim bankruptcy.
There you go. Well, we do know with Jim Banks, if he's not with Lindsey Graham, he's in Virginia.
Virginia's 3rd senator, along with Tim Kaine and Mark Warner.
And folks, what I don't like is how they are destroying the Republican Party, how they have destroyed the conservative movement by voting so liberally when we, the Republicans, had the majority. There is no excuse to be adding to the nation's debt when we have the absolute majority in the House, the Senate, and we have the presidency. No matter who we vote for, it seems, we only get Democrats, whether it's Jim Banks, Todd Young, or any member of Congress. They all have voted for Democrat levels of government spending. They have all voted for massive increases in our nation's debt.
And John, you just made an important point because you said that you don't like what they're doing to the Republican Party, and as a young
it's horrible what they're doing to the Republican Party. It's destroying the Republican Party's image, and it's destroying the enthusiasm I see from young people to even want to vote Republican because of how despicable our alleged conservative Republicans have voted in Washington,
and
D.C.
that's why you're seeing in places like Florida, for example, they're going up against, they're saying no to Byron Donalds, and they're saying yes to another young guy, James Fishback.
No, folks, this is from Dan Hill. if we replaced all 535 of our D.C. representatives with regular folks with no ties to donors, they would probably balance the budget and pass the SAVE Act in 2 weeks. You know, it's pretty obvious that we have the donor career politician class in D.C.
It's shameful.
It is shameful.
Well, and it ties back to BlackRock and Blackstone. Folks, you all know BlackRock and Blackstone are these hedge funds that go around and buy corporations and destroy them, all in the name of a quick buck. And then they abandon that company and, you know, leave all these American jobs on the side of the street, abandoned.
I believe that's called vulture capitalism.
These are the people, you know, look who they finance. They finance Jim Banks and Todd Young. Both Jim Banks and Todd Young have taken money from BlackRock. And folks, it's getting even worse now. Listen to this. Blackstone is launching a hedge fund for multimillionaires only. You may not participate if you are not a multimillionaire. It is only open to investors worth at least $5 million.
It's a big club and you ain't in it.
It's like George Carlin said. You're exactly right.
Folks, that's Blackstone. Listen to this. Based on campaign data from Open Secrets, individuals associated with Blackstone Group have contributed to Senator Jim Banks' campaign with a total of $72,000 in contributions up to 2024. You know, you have to be at least a millionaire to get access to Jim Banks. That is why he moved to Virginia, to be closer to his donors and to hide from regular Hoosiers who he doesn't even want to see.
Yeah, he doesn't want to see him. And even when you try to go to his Senate offices, well, he's supposed to have at least a lot of them in this state. He only's got, as of right now, he's got one in D.C. That's no surprise there.
And two
and
here.
Then he's got only two here, one in Fort Wayne and then one in Hammond, which doesn't even have a phone number.
Exactly. So there's no accessibility.
So it's an office
the
in name only. Why is Jim Banks like that, folks? It's because he is beholden to the donor class. Listen to this. The total number of money lobbyists spend per year comes out to $9.5 million for each member of Congress. That's $9.5 million in bribes per member of Congress. That's not for the entire Congress. That's per member. Well, that's why Congress regularly ignores the will of the American people. That's why the SAVE Act has not been passed. They couldn't care less about that. And folks, on Jim Banks, he has this dark money fund that is funding some state Senate Republican challengers here in Indiana. $5 million. You know, I think a far better use for that $5 million would be to target Congressman Mervan in the 1st District. $5 million would win that district for the state of Indiana.
That is a swing district. And why isn't he, if he
$5 million would win that district, and we would gain one member of Congress in the House for Republicans.
You wouldn't even have to redistrict.
And instead, they're using this money for personal petty vindictiveness here in Indiana.
And you know what the funny thing is? If he wanted to, he could use that money to at least try to target Andre Carson, but he won't because they vote the same way and they're buddies.
That's right, and this goes back to...
But Mervan's district is so easy to take, and $5 million would, in a heartbeat, gain the Republicans one seat in the House. And instead, Jim Banks is just flushing that money down the toilet.
Just like what he does with our tax dollars.
So, folks, we're out of time for this segment. When we come back, I want to talk about how the Veterans Administration canceled a $56,000 contract to water plants. $56,000 to water, guess how many plants? Just 8, folks. We will be right back to talk about this further on The John Rush Show on Freedom 95. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on Freedom 95, The John Rust Show, broadcasting at 9:50 a.m. and 95.9 FM all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana. Folks, before the break, we were talking about how the VA canceled a $56,000 contract to water plants in Washington, D.C. It was $56,000 for 5 years to water a grand total of 8 plants. 8 plants, folks. That is Washington in a nutshell. Spending money like there is no tomorrow because they don't care. It is easier for someone like Jim Banks or any member of Congress to say, well, we'll just appropriate more money for the Pentagon or whoever because we don't want to do our job of being fiscal overseers. We don't want to go in and call a hearing and find out why all this money is being wasted. You don't hear anything about that. This is exactly why Todd Starnes had to say all this. He says, don't listen to the spin coming from the Senate Republicans. Democrats got everything they wanted. American voters got screwed. There was a reason why John Thune scheduled the vote while the nation was asleep. Folks, that vote he's talking about was at 3 a.m. where they skipped town. So they could skip town before the voters woke up and discovered what they had done. Here's the real kick in the pants. Republican senators left for yet another vacation without doing anything about the SAVE Act. There's no polite way to say this, but Senate Republicans are sabotaging the midterm election and President Trump's agenda. That's from Todd Starnes.
And he's right. He is absolutely right.
Again, this is from Todd Starnes. Senate Republicans never had any intention of passing the Save America Act. And folks, what the Save America Act would do is simply require ID when you go in to vote. You know, you have to have ID to sign up for welfare benefits. You have to have ID to buy cough medicine at the supermarket. You have to have ID to buy liquor at a liquor store. Why shouldn't you have simple ID to prove who you are when you go vote? And folks, 81% of all Americans, Democrats and Republicans, strongly support that bill. But the Republicans in the Senate are doing squat about it. They are sitting on it because they really don't want to pass it. And again, it's because, folks, I know this sounds crazy, but it's the truth. The Republicans in the Senate would rather be in the minority, because then they can thump their chest and say how conservative they are against the evil liberal Democrats, even though when the Republicans are in the majority, they're the ones doing all the liberal spending, aka like Jim Banks and Todd Young voting for Joe Biden levels of government spending and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of new debt. Once again, folks, when Jim Banks and Todd Young were sworn into Congress in 2017, your share of the national debt was $170,000 per taxpayer. Today, that is well over $350,000 per taxpayer in just those few short years. Well, and what are they doing? You know, listen, this is from the Wall Street Journal. Elizabeth Warren's housing coup. The U.S. Senate is about to pass a bill that is great for progressives. This was published on March 10th, 2026. Republicans want to show voters they're doing something to ease housing costs. The result, alas, is a pork-filled bill hitting the Senate floor this week that is a big win for Senator Elizabeth Warren and the political left. It establishes multiple grant and loan programs for affordable housing while expanding federal power over local zoning. You know, why is the Senate GOP pushing Elizabeth Warren's progressive housing bill? You know, folks, it's all Con Inc., Conservative Incorporated, and that's a loose coalition of self-interested rhinos and neoconservatives who pretend to be conservative, but just look at Jim Banks and Todd Young. You know, they both voted for this First Step Act, which released criminals from prison early because they're soft on crime. They don't believe criminals should do the time for the crimes they've committed. You know, we talked about the new debt. Just in 2025, folks, Jim Banks and Todd Young both voted for an additional $30,000 in debt for you. And I'm talking to you right now. If you're driving that car up the road on I-65, they added $30,000 of debt you or your kids are going to have to pay off someday. $30,000. That would buy over 8,000 gallons of gas. If you had 8,000 gallons of gas, you could drive your car 180,000 miles. But instead of being able to use that money for yourself, you or your kids in the future are going to have to pay that off. That's gasoline being taken away from you. That's a future home down payment being taken away from you. We wonder why Hoosiers face the #1 home foreclosure rate in the United States. It's because these people like Jim Banks and Todd Young are devaluing the American dollar by voting for all this massive debt. So, folks, you know what the U.S. Senate did have time for before they went on recess, went to Disney World? They unanimously approved a dog show. I kid you not. Jim Banks, Todd Young, every member of the U.S. Senate voted to approve a dog show in the Hart Office building. You know, it's in the official record in the United States Senate, and it's Senate Resolution 611. By Tom Tillis, submitted the following resolution, which was considered and agreed to unanimously. That means Jim Banks and Todd Young said yes to that. You know, to have a dog show rather than working to pass the SAVE Act, to have a dog show rather than working to pass meaningful financial reform in government spending to actually lower government spending, to have a dog show rather than working on cutting our nation's debt.
I have so many questions about why they would want a dog show. Look, I love dogs as much as the next guy, but at this point, it's DC
I do
in
too,
a
folks.
nutshell.
I have a German Shepherd. I love my dog.
Oh, I love German Shepherds.
They're
but
the
at this
best.
point, it's like Congress votes for so many stupid things.
Well, folks, for every $5 Washington collects in taxes, $1 now goes to interest on the debt. A stunning $1 out of 5 is going for nothing. Well, it's not going for nothing. It's going to the political donors of Jim Banks and Todd Young. And it's all at your expense. It is all debt being weighed to your shoulders. Folks, it's getting worse. Just in February this year, the U.S. national debt increased $3,000 in 1 month per taxpayer. $3,000 in 1 month.
Dang.
And what are the establishment Republicans in Washington calling for? They're saying Americans should retire later to help pay down the nation's debt.
Yeah, like
Hell
that's going to
no.
solve it. Yeah, like that's going
No.
to solve anything. It's not.
You know, I am so sick of the Republican establishment saying you have to work until you die. You know, Dr. Oz said that. He's quoted as saying that. He said Americans should retire later to help pay down the nation's debt.
No wonder he lost that Senate race. Shame on him.
That's right.
And Jim Banks, remember, folks, when Jim Banks was chairman of the Republican Study Committee, they were pushing to raise the retirement age. Again, I'll say hell no. And folks, I want to repeat this. I want to talk about this because Social Security is important. You worked for that your entire life. You are entitled to that benefit. We are so sick of these career politicians taking that money in Washington and spending it on their donors. You know, spending it, for $1,000 to water a plant for a year. You know, that's insanity. That is fiscal irresponsibility. You know, folks, I'm from Seymour, Indiana, birthplace of John Cougar Mellencamp, who I never met. But guess what, folks? His mother was my mail lady. She was my mail lady for years back in the early 1980s. While John was already famous, I asked her, I said, why are you still, delivering my mail? And she says, I am working to get my full retirement benefit. I'm not going to quit early just because I can. She wanted to receive something she worked her whole life for. People like Jim Banks and the Republican establishment wanted to make her work even longer. No, we have a contract. Social Security, in my opinion, is something you can never cut from people. But people like Jim Banks, that's always the first thing they see to do is to cut it from regular Hoosiers. Why? Remember, folks, he called for an influx of immigration in 2017 in the Atlantic magazine. Why did he do that? He did that because his donors wanted cheap foreign labor to come in and take jobs away from Hoosiers and lower the pay they're paying for Hoosiers.
And what's the hypocrisy of it is he was complaining, I think it was 2 years ago, about the Atlantic magazine. Well, that's funny that you're complaining about the magazine that you were so happy to give an interview to.
So hypocritical.
Well, folks, Americans are hurting, and they're hurting because of people like Jim Banks. Listen to this. Americans are now taking more hardship withdrawals from their 401k retirement accounts than any time in history. That is beyond sad.
It is.
Americans are hurting. Gas prices are going through the roof. Now the Indiana Republican establishment wants to put tolls on every mile of Indiana interstate. While the government just spends money so frivolously. Listen to this, folks. Did you know that the Department of Defense spent $98,329 for a Steinway grand piano for the Air Force Chief of Staff's home?
It's ridiculous.
$98,000 for a piano.
My question is, does that dude even play that piano? I'd love to know. Does he really need that expensive one? And speaking of tolls, Justin,
they're fiddling while Rome burns, literally.
That's
That's
right.
what's going on. Jim Banks and all these people, they want to make Washington, D.C. the new Rome. It is a drunken orgy of spending.
That is so accurate.
Well, when you're spending, $50,000 to water plants and $98,000 for one piano, folks, this is from Daniel Horowitz again. So here's what's hilarious. When Republicans want to, they break the rules. Last year, during reconciliation, to extend the 2017 tax cuts without scoring them as new spending, the GOP simply redefined current policy as current law. When Senator Bernie Moreno presided over the chamber, he ruled the provision in order without even consulting the parliamentarians. who most certainly would have objected. The point is, they can get anything done, folks, in Washington they really want to, if they just choose to do so. But they choose not to do so. They push through what they want, like this communist housing bill and this bill on AI data centers to force more data centers on rural areas. It is just their priorities. Again, this is from Daniel Horowitz. It is just their priorities that they enact, not yours. And folks, we were talking about toll roads here earlier this month. BlackRock, big surprise, had their U.S. Infrastructure Summit. The governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, was asked how to pay for the roads. She says, "We have started to look at the possibility of toll roads in Michigan." The left-wing, moonbat left Democrat governor of Michigan is getting ideas on how to govern her state from a conservative governor here from an allegedly conservative governor here in Indiana.
Well,
folks, again, it is absolutely positively not conservative in any way, shape, or form to enact tolling in Indiana. It should never, ever be done. I am 100% opposed to that. Why? Because it is a tax on working people, people that are going to work, that are already paying one of the highest gasoline taxes in the country, should not be paying, in addition to that, tolls to go to work and then to go back home. To all what? To pay for the welfare benefits for those that aren't working, to pay for the specialty projects of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, to pick winners and losers who are connected to the political donor class, career politician favorites. Hell no, folks. This is John Rust, and that's why I'm standing up against this. This is John Rust. We are out of time for this segment, but we will be right back on Freedom 95. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on Freedom 95, the John Rust Show, broadcasting at 950 AM and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, the right station for talk, all across the beautiful fruited plain of Indiana. And folks, every few shows I like to say the origin story of the fruited plain, and it came from Rush Limbaugh. Folks, I know a lot of you, like me, spent a lot of your life listening to Rush Limbaugh on the radio. He was a founding father to me in terms of helping shape my conservatism. Number one, because it was always economically practical. Number two, it was always positive. And number three, it was always extremely pro-American.
There will never be another like him.
What a wonderful human being Rush Limbaugh was. So, folks, before the break, we were talking about Governor Whitmer, who's this left-wing nutjob governor of Michigan, and she's talking about getting that quote-unquote wonderful idea to toll roads like they do in Indiana, apparently. Unfortunately, this should not be, Indiana should not be a beacon to the left on how to enact harmful economic policies on working people. So, folks, we all know about the speed cameras, the flock cameras, and those are really to track you. But guess what? The Michigan Democrats are now pushing for speeding cameras every 1/4 of a mile so that they can monitor every Michigan driver. Folks, again, they got that idea from Indiana with all of our flock cameras going up across the state. So, folks, they're saying this in jest, but this is what's going to happen in the future. Listen to this. So they're putting up these speeding cameras every 1/4 of a mile. So if we get 30 tickets a day for going 5 miles over the speed limit, will they use the kill switch in your car to turn off your car if you don't pay the ticket on time? That's the future. These predatory Republicans and Democrats are pushing on the people in their states. Rob Kendall used that term predatory, and I think it's an apt term when you talk about the establishment in both parties, because they view people who work for a living as just someone to tax, someone to toll.
They view us as, I'd go further. They view us as serfs and peasants.
Exactly. And, I was thinking, why does it seem like these career politicians care more about us speeding than like all these illegal immigrants and the national debt? They don't care about that. They just care about us speeding.
And they don't even live in our communities. They live in gated neighborhoods.
Exactly.
So why do they care?
And it's predatory. And did you know that the gasoline tax increase that was enacted on April 1st was automatic? And that was put through a Republican supermajority, folks. That wasn't a Democrat bill. That was a Republican bill that automatically increases your gasoline taxes.
That was in 2017 when we had well over 70 something seats in the Indiana House of Representatives. In the state Senate, it was 41 Republicans and 9 Democrats. Keep that in mind.
Well, that's why I'm calling on Governor Braun to immediately suspend the gasoline tax entirely. I'm calling on him to call in the Indiana General Assembly in a special session to do away with the gasoline tax as it is written now and come back with one that is appropriate for our state, for our needs of our roads, not to be given to billionaire sports team owners like they want to do up north.
What all goes back to, as long as the IEDC is in power in Indiana, ain't nothing good is going to get done.
And that's the problem with the gasoline tax. As long as gasoline taxes are being funneled through the IEDC to political donor corporations connected to our quote-unquote conservative Republicans in our state, that's not the conservative free market at work. No. That's socialism. Socialism is about the redistribution of wealth from the productive class to the political class. I'm going to repeat that again. Socialism is about the redistribution of wealth from the productive class to the political class. And folks, what I mean by that is, if you're listening to the show and you're going to work, you're part of the productive class. I'm a farmer. I'm producing a dozen eggs that someone hopefully will buy. That's being productive. If you're going to work as a plumber to fix plumbing somewhere, that's being productive. If you're a school teacher teaching kids, the 3 R's, that's fantastic. You are being productive. If you're going to work to raise taxes on someone, you're a predator. That's what's happening in the state of Indiana. And I don't use that term lightly. Again, Rob Kendall came up with that term when he talked about how our career politician class in Indiana have become these economic predators over the people who work for a living. They just sit there and dream of ways they can tax you more. For instance, not only do we have the second highest sales tax in the country, property taxes going through the roof, we have one of the highest gasoline taxes in the country. They want to do the tolls. Well, the Indiana GOP establishment are also the ones who introduced the wheel tax. The wheel tax, folks, is a local county tax going in to tax your personal cars even more than they already were. They just continuously look for new ways to tax and tax and tax you.
Before long, we ain't going to have no money left.
Yeah, and that just shows you, especially at the IEDC, at this point is beyond repair. It needs to be totally abolished.
The IEDC, I say abolish it and let the private sector grow the right way, as you have said.
Well, if a company cannot survive without government subsidy, they should not exist.
You can look at Solyndra to know that that's true, because they went bankrupt and were raided by the feds.
Well, and all these quote-unquote green energy companies, they only make money based on how much taxpayer dollars they are getting to subsidize them, quote-unquote, for the green ideal, the Green New Deal scam. And folks, speaking of the Green New Deal scam, you can think of all you want of global warming. Maybe the temperature is rising, maybe not, I don't know. The premise of the Green New Deal scam is that carbon is evil. Listen to this, folks. You as a human being breathe out 2 pounds of carbon dioxide every day. So if carbon is bad, you're bad. They're talking about carbon sequestration here in Indiana, where they're going to bury the carbon because it is quote unquote bad. Does that mean they're going to bury us too because we breathe carbon? Folks, I'm here in the studio with Justin, and Aiden, and Aiden brought up a very good point. Trees need carbon dioxide. We are all saying, oh, carbon dioxide's bad. That's hogwash. Carbon dioxide is an absolute wonderful thing. Carbon's a wonderful thing.
It is.
If you're married and you might look at your wedding ring and there's a good chance there may be a piece of carbon on it in the form of a diamond. Are we going to have to go out and bury all those too? Well, folks, the reason I do this show is I want America to embrace free market capitalism again. I am a Margaret Thatcher conservative. She always believed in the power of the free market, and Thomas Massey is espousing that as well. Listen to this. He says, if America would embrace capitalism and reject cronyism in healthcare, agriculture, military contracting, insurance, media, technology, and banking, we would experience a renaissance unprecedented in human history. Amen, and absolutely, and I agree 100%.
Amen.
Yes.
And we're going to be doing a show on this in the future, talking about healthcare costs. You know, folks, the United States spends more on health care than any other country on the planet. And yet we have this horrible system where people that work for a living really don't have health care. You know, it is so expensive. It is exorbitantly expensive just to go into an emergency room. If you have a broken leg, you're going to be shocked at what that bill will be. And for what we spend on health care, and you know where all that money goes, it certainly doesn't go to the doctors. It certainly doesn't go to the nurses. It goes to the health insurance companies, to the bigwigs that own the health insurance companies. And you know who these health insurance companies donate to? It is the career politician class. Again, it is Jim Banks and Todd Young who receive so much money from the healthcare industry, while we realistically have very expensive, or in reality, very little health care, unless you're on Medicaid. You know, if you're working for a living, and folks, Daniel Horowitz had an excellent point on this. This is again from Daniel Horowitz. Most middle-income earners, at best, earn twice the income of a Medicaid recipient, often a lot less. Yet, those who work, they must pay 20 times more on health care a year, whether direct or coming out of what would be your salary. You know, that is the innate unfairness of American medical care is how it is being doled out as a political favor to those that don't work. Well, Thomas Massey is right on this. He says we would, again, folks, experience a renaissance, unprecedented in human history, if America would embrace capitalism and reject cronyism. When he's talking about on cronyism, and I'll put that in Indiana terms, it's the IEDC taking your tax dollars and giving that money to political crony companies of our elected political leadership here in Indiana. That's absolutely wrong, and that's why I have always 100% called for the IEDC to be completely and 100% abolished. 100%.
Absolutely, and as a young conservative Republican, I can absolutely get behind that 100%.
Thomas Massey was right. If you hate capitalism, it's just because you have only experienced the capitalism, in quotes, that the establishment pretends we have today, folks. We do not have free market capitalism, folks, in so much of our economy today. We do not have free market capitalism in Indiana. If your tax dollars are going to the IEDC to pick winners and losers, that is not the market choosing what should succeed in the world. That is a career politician. And folks, how that relates to Indiana is, you know, AES, it was just announced as being sold to BlackRock. You know, the Republicans, folks, could have stopped this in its tracks, but they didn't. This is from the Indianapolis Star, published March 26, 2026, by an article by Gregory W. Porter. And he's talking about how a lot of Republican establishment politicians here in Indiana are, quote unquote, extremely concerned about BlackRock buying AES, which will invariably lead to higher electric rates for all Hoosiers.
Are they, though? They're not concerned.
Folks, they had a chance to stop it in its tracks. Listen to this. This is from the article. Ever since AES announced its pending sale to a consortium led by BlackRock, Central Indiana has been abuzz, and rightly so. Folks, this is from the Indianapolis Star. There was an amendment put forward by a state representative which would have required utility companies to get approval from the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission before being sold. All but one House Republican voted no on this amendment, paving the way for AES to be sold with no backstop from our state utility regulators. Folks, that's from the Indianapolis Star. And what they're talking about is there was an amendment to a very important utility bill that would have stopped BlackRock from buying AES in its tracks. But almost all Republicans in the House, unfortunately, voted against it. Now we have no say in AES being purchased by BlackRock. And folks, we're only hearing about this story now because of the article. It's embarrassing our state establishment again for doing nothing. All they do is sit around dreaming how to toll and tax you more rather than being good fiscal stewards of the money that they're getting in. So folks, we're out of time for this segment. When we come back, we're going to talk about when immigrants arrived in Ellis Island, they were instructed to assimilate into American culture, but that's not happening today. We're going to talk about this broad topic of assimilation into America and what it means for all Hoosiers when we come back. This is John Rust on the Radio. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on Freedom 95, The John Rust Show, broadcasting at 9:50 a.m. and 95.9 FM on your radio dial, the right station for talk. So, folks, I'm reading something from Classic Learner on Twitter. It says, when immigrants arrived at Ellis Island, assimilating into American culture wasn't an option, it was required. But today there are immigrants who are literally burning American flags in the street. Why are we allowing our country to be destroyed by suicidal tolerance? I quote Abraham Lincoln a lot on this show, specifically talking about elections. And real quickly, I want to veer into our upcoming May 5th primary coming up. Please absolutely register to vote and vote in your Republican primaries. We absolutely need you to vote against any incumbent. Vote for the challenger, no matter what. We need new blood in Washington and here in Indiana. I always quote Abraham Lincoln, and he said something very important. Elections belong to the people. It's their decision. He also said the American Constitution is not a suicide pact. And I'm referencing that there on immigration into the United States. This is from Charlie Kirk. Islam does not believe in freedom of speech. Islam does not believe in freedom of religion. And Islam does not believe in separation of mosque and state. It is not compatible with Western values. In a free society, no ideology, including Islam, is beyond debate or criticism. But this is from an imam in Michigan. It says, Muslims are superior to the infidels because they are willing to blow themselves up.
Then again, that Michigan Dearborn's been taken over.
So, folks, this is from Matt Walsh. Most folks don't realize that the Muslim population in America has more than doubled after 9/11. Our government responded to the 9/11 by mass importing the Arab world into our country. National suicide. No other term to describe it. That's from Matt Walsh. Folks, what he's specifically talking about is Jim Banks and Todd Young voting to double the number of Afghan immigrants coming into the United States. And so, folks, when Jim Banks called for an influx of immigrants in 2017 in the Atlantic magazine, I've talked about where he was really working for his donors that wanted lower labor costs by importing cheap labor. But I think also the Republican study group was looking at it, and Jim Banks was a future chairman of that.
He was the chairman in the House.
And they're concerned, and this is a broad topic, but they're concerned about the birth rate being too low in our country. My response to the birth rate being too low in the United States is it's because our dollars are worth so little compared to what they used to be. How could you afford to raise a large family today compared to what it was 15, 20, 30 years ago?
I mean, people can barely afford to take care of themselves, let alone a family.
Importing migrants of other cultures to suppress wages for our citizens, to replace your culture, to increase crime rates, to dramatically increase the welfare budget due to migrants who refuse to work. Again, Americans are having fewer kids because their own paychecks have been devalued by Todd Young and Jim Banks.
I mean, I'm over here spending almost all my paychecks on gasoline. I mean, I have barely any money for anything else.
Folks, this is from Ken Colbert. Dateline Evansville. Aiding and abetting illegal aliens in Indiana was one of the catalysts through Indiana legislation to create proposed driving cards for TPS, aka Temporary Protected Status, non-English speaking illegal aliens to knowingly drive large trucks in Indiana. DriveCo was an active contract with Indiana Workforce Development to quote-unquote teach the fast-track 4-week course. What could possibly go wrong? And folks, we saw the result of that in the horrific wrecks just a few weeks ago, where an illegal was here with a driver's license.
Given to him by the BMV.
By the Indiana BMV.
Yes. Our state's BMV.
Well,
Well, again, this was allowed by Eric Holcomb. He was all for this. Of course, he's the same guy who let the Afghans in, those Afghan refugees, and put them in Camp Atterbury.
That Jim Banks voted to double.
Yeah, he voted them in. So they said put him in. Holcomb and Banks were like, yeah, we'll put him in Camp Atterbury. Jim Banks is talking a big game now. He's had enough of it. Senator, you said to the Atlantic magazine, this is what you wanted, the influx of immigration. Isn't this what you dreamed of?
So, folks, in farming news, I want to address something, and this is from Meriwether Farms, and we're talking about the United States Department of Agriculture refuses to mandate country of origin labels for our food supply. I am all for allowing Argentinian beef to come into the United States. I believe in the free market, but it should be labeled as Argentinian beef. Today, folks, listen to this. That Argentinian beef can be processed in an American facility and sold as product of the USA. That is wrong. So the USDA recently said, well, we're coming out with this new, quote unquote, voluntary country of origin labeling where producers can volunteer that their product is made in Argentina or America or Mexico or wherever it is. It should be 100% mandatory. If you go into Walmart or Kroger and you buy a steak, you should know where that beef was produced.
Exactly, because wouldn't that be false advertising saying that the beef came from America when it came from Argentina?
Unfortunately today, Justin, as the law stands, you can buy a hamburger and it will say product of the USA on it, but it actually could be Argentinian or Mexican or Lord knows from where, because the law specifically says if it is processed in the United States, then it can be sold as product of the United States.
Gotta love them loopholes, don't you?
No, and that's just wrong because that's hurting American farmers. Folks, I'm a farmer. In my family, we produce eggs, all across the United States, but mostly here in Indiana. We 100% support mandatory country of origin labels. 100%.
I mean, that's just common sense. I mean, the country of origin, the one that's labeled, would should be the one that it actually came from.
Well, but again, I'm all for the free market. If you want to import eggs from Turkey and have turkey eggs, maybe that's not a good example because you'll think, well, are those from Turkey? Are those from the animal turkey? But it should be labeled where it's coming from. Correct. And so this is from Meriwether Farms. The USDA is purposefully gaslighting the American people right now, claiming that there is a new requirement for product of the USA labeling on beef. What they are failing to include in all that is the rule was initially introduced by the Biden Ag Secretary in March of 2024. Number two, it is not a requirement. It is completely voluntary and provides no additional transparency to foreign imported beef. So please do not confuse this with mandatory country of origin labeling, which again, Thomas Massey absolutely supports. And unfortunately, our Republican establishment politicians here in Indiana have been silent on or only giving lip service to. We need absolute 100% country of origin labeling for all food sold in the United States. I always say, speak the truth, shame the devil. Sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Why does it seem like Thomas Massey is the only Republican we have who actually agrees with that and who actually wants, is it about common sense?
Again, this is from Meriwether Farms. Sorry, but this is a voluntary label, and that is why it is so deceptive. What this label does is it continues to stack the burden of proof of paperwork, segregation protocols, etc. onto the small producer. It is just another marketing ploy that is already available to them. We've been using the USA claims for years voluntarily, but what we want is mandatory country of origin sourcing for all of our food. When you walk into a grocery store and buy produce, you should see a mandated country of origin label, that says product of United States, product of Mexico, or wherever it is. It shouldn't be in doubt where that food was produced. Unfortunately, today, folks, it's totally in doubt. You have no clue.
This is the reason why I say, if you can, buy local, but whether it's eggs, beef, whatever, if it's produce and it's something you can buy local, I would do that. I go to your local farmers markets and all of that, so that way you actually know exactly where your food is coming from. That's at least what I do anyway.
So, folks, it is Easter time, and I want to talk about something that Billy Graham once said. He says the heart of the Christian gospel is in the cross and the resurrection. When God sent his Son to earth to die on the cross, he made a way for us to be made new. Jesus bore the weight of all of our sins. Without the resurrection, there could be no salvation. Christ predicted his resurrection many times. So, folks, during this Easter season, may the peace of the Lord be with you. Thank you so much for listening, and I want to close with my father's favorite Bible verse, Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Folks, this is John Rust on the Radio. I will see you all again next week.